topic of today, yeah. The topic of today's presentation is fighting for the Jews on stage, the Bergson Group, We Will Never Die, and A Flag is Born. And our presenter today is Dr. Rafael Medoff. Dr. Medoff is the founding director of the David S. Wyman Institute for Holocaust Studies based in Washington, D.C. Which focuses on America's response to Nazism and the Holocaust. He has taught Jewish history at Ohio State University, Purchase College, State University of New York, and elsewhere. He served as associate editor of the scholarly journal American Jewish History and contributed to the Encyclopedia Judaica and many other reference volumes. Dr. Medoff is the author of more than 20 books on the Holocaust, Zionism, and American Jewish history. He and the late Professor David Wyman were the co-authors of the very first scholarly book about the Bergson Group, A Race Against Death, which was published in 2002. Later, he edited the memoirs of a Bergson Group leader, Samuel Merlin, in a book called Millions of Jews to Rescue. Dr. Medoff's latest book is The Jews Should Keep Quiet, Franklin Roosevelt, Rabbi Stephen S. Wise, and the Holocaust, published by the Jewish Publication Society of America and University of Nebraska Press. You can read reviews of it in the latest issue of Commentary Magazine and the Jewish Review of Books. I will add two personal notes here. In addition to this, one, I first became familiar with Dr. Medoff in 2004 when I was partner in a law firm in Chicago, and there was a dedication of Ben Hecht Way in front of the Newberry Library, and I had hoped to hear him speak there. I missed him there, but I've caught him many times since. He's published regularly in the newspapers, and he has some excellent videos on YouTube. I highly recommend those. Also, if anybody wants to be on his mailing list, you're invited to do so at rafaelmedoff@aol.com. And if you want the address, you need some help with that, send me a note afterwards. I'm glad to make the connection. So with that, Dr. Medoff, I think I'll put myself on mute. Everybody else, please keep your cameras and yourself on mute, and we'll focus on Dr. Medoff exclusively. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. I appreciate the opportunity to share a few thoughts with you and your colleagues and other friends who are joining us today to talk about the history, impact, legacy of the Bergson Group. When I speak about the Bergson Group, I always begin by sharing a poll, a Gallup poll that was taken in January 1943, the results of which illustrate why the Bergson Group arose and why it did what it did. A poll taken in January 1943 meant that it was about a month after the Allied governments, the Americans, the British, the Soviets, and others, had all publicly confirmed in a joint statement in December that the Germans were undertaking what they call the systematic extermination of the Jews in Europe. They calculated that some 2 million Jews had already been slaughtered. So a month after that Allied announcement, which had appeared very widely in the American news media, the press, Gallup asked a sample of the American public, it is said that 2 million Jews have been killed by the Nazis in Europe. Do you believe that this is the case? Only 47% of the American public believed it. 29% said they did not believe it. The rest said they had no opinion. So less than half of the American public even believed that it was true, despite the fact that their own government and the other allies had already, weeks earlier, confirmed that it was true. This was the first and most important obstacle that the Bergson Group faced in devising its strategy of how to respond to the news of the mass murder. If a problem is not known, then there's very little chance of moving a government or influencing policy or convincing leaders to adopt a new approach, to take any interest in it. If nobody knows about it, nobody cares about it. And that was the first problem that the Bergson Group faced. Now, the reasons for the American public's disbelief or skepticism, let's call it, a large segment of the public skepticism. Again, 29% didn't believe it. Only 47% did. The reasons were several. The first and probably most important was the by now well-known fact that major daily newspapers such as the New York Times deliberately downplayed the news. They buried it in the back pages, to borrow a phrase from the most important, the only study, scholarly study of the New York Times' response to the Holocaust, its coverage of that news, called Buried by the Times by Professor Laurel Leff. The publishers of the New York Times buried the news of the plight of the Jews because they themselves, as profoundly assimilated Jews, did not want to call attention to the Jewish plight and did not want it said of the Times that the Times was excessively interested in Jewish issues. So because the news was buried in the back pages, not only the Times, but this was a phenomenon that was widespread in the American news media. Because it was buried in the back pages, or in some cases not published at all, the American public wasn't hearing a lot about it. Therefore, a kind of almost instinctive skepticism set in. Instinctive because many Americans still remember that in World War I, there had been numerous reports about German atrocities, especially in Belgium, that later turned out to be exaggerated or fabricated. So beginning with that skepticism and then not hearing very much about what the Germans were doing to the Jews this time around, it was hard to convince Americans, enough Americans, a majority of Americans, that this was really happening and that therefore, because it was happening, perhaps the United States should do something about it. The Political Action Committee, to which we refer as the Bergson Group, was not officially the Bergson Group. That was the popular nickname because this group began with a rather unwieldy name during its first year of activity in the United States, and then graduated to another rather unwieldy name. And so it just became easier for people to say the Bergson Group because its leader used in public the name Peter Bergson. That was a pseudonym for Hillel Koch. Koch was a young Jewish activist who had come from British-controlled Palestine to the United States in 1940 as an emissary, as one of a number of emissaries of the Zionist leader Vladimir Zev Jabotinsky. When Koch first arrived in the U.S. in 1940, his mission was focused not on rescuing Jewish refugees, although that was certainly a part of it, but primarily on the idea that there should be a Jewish army created to participate in World War II alongside the Allies. So his group began with the name the Committee for a Jewish Army of Stateless and Palestinian Jews. That was the name under which they operated for their first year, in which they promoted this notion of a Jewish army. I won't go into the history now of that proposal, except to say that it ultimately led, or let's say played a large part in the British government's decision late in the war to establish a Jewish armed force known as the Jewish Brigade, which saw action in Europe during the final months of the war, and then many of whose members later were involved in smuggling Holocaust survivors to Palestine in 1946-47, and many of those Jewish Brigade veterans subsequently fought in the Israeli War of Independence in 1948. In any event, when news of the mass killing was confirmed in late 1942 by that Allied announcement, to which I referred a little while ago, Hillel Koch, Peter Bergson, and his colleagues, the other Jabotinsky emissaries who had come to America, decided that they needed to change their focus and devote all of their attention and time to the more immediate, the more urgent problem of rescuing the Jews of Europe. So they, in effect, set aside the Jewish Army campaign entirely. And the protest tactics that they had been using to try to publicize the Jewish Army issue became the tactics they used to publicize the idea of rescue. That meant full-page newspaper advertisements, lobbying in Washington, and public rallies. All three of these areas of activity were relatively new, in some cases quite new, for the American Jewish community. And note again that I pointed out at the beginning, Hillel Kook was not an American Jew, and the others who came with him were around the same time as he did. I'll mention a few of their names: Samuel Merlin, Yitzchak Ben-Ami, Alexander Raphaeli, and others, Eri Jabotinsky as well, the son of Zev Jabotinsky. None of these men were Americans, and that's an important factor when we talk about the Bergson Group and the tactics they used and what they achieved, because they didn't have the same kinds of worries and fears that many American Jews had. What I mean by that is Jews who, like ourselves, those of us who are in the United States, who live in America, are naturally have an ongoing interest in, let's say, relations between the American Jewish community and non-Jews. And specifically, the issue of anti-Semitism in America was something which was deeply troubling to many American Jews at that time, and for good reason, because anti-Semitism was at an all-time high. But for men like Bergson, Merlin, Ben-Ami, and the others, they were coming from Palestine or Europe, and they were only in the United States temporarily. They weren't really very concerned about the status of Jews in America or relations between Jews and non-Jews in America in the future. They were men who would come here temporarily to address a particular crisis, an emergency, as they called it, and as it became their calling card. And so they were willing to use protest tactics, which for that time were considered very forceful, very forward. There were kinds of tactics that most American Jews shied away from. The idea, for example, of taking out full-page ads in newspapers. This was something that had never been done before by American Jewish organizations. Now, you can understand, since we've just talked briefly about the American news media's failure to cover the mass killings, you can understand why the Bergson Group was very interested in taking out newspaper ads, because if they couldn't get coverage in the news columns, these papers, then the only alternative was to purchase advertising space. During the period 1941 to 1945, the Bergson Group sponsored more than 200 full-page newspaper ads in major newspapers around the country. Many were in the New York Times and other important newspapers, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, the Chicago Tribune, but also many other newspapers. The ads were considered shocking by some of the established Jewish leaders, who felt that the Bergson Group was being too militant and pushing Jewish concerns too much to the fore. From the Bergson Group's point of view, though, the ads were, if anything, mild. And in retrospect, when we actually look at the text of the ads, we find that they almost never criticized President Franklin Roosevelt directly. Now, this is not because the Bergson Group thought that Roosevelt was trying to help the Jews. On the contrary, they understood clearly from the beginning that Roosevelt had very little interest in doing anything meaningful to help Jewish refugees. But they recognized that he was an extremely popular president, and especially in the midst of a world war, they felt, I believe correctly, that if they had more forthrightly criticized the president, that it might have backfired. The message was clear nonetheless. When they spoke of the Jews being abandoned and even referred to the American government to a certain extent, it was very clear that they were referring to the Roosevelt administration, but without specifically naming the president. Many of the ads, certainly the ones that were the most shocking for the time and caused the most controversy, were written by the playwright and journalist, Hollywood screenwriter, Ben Hecht. Hecht was part of an interesting group of cultural figures, celebrities, writers, intellectuals, Hollywood figures, Broadway stars, who joined the ranks of the Bergson Group. The way that Bergson actually became acquainted with Hecht, however, was not quite the same as many of the other celebrities who joined. What happened in Hecht's case is that in 1941, Hecht used to write a weekly newspaper column for the now defunct New York City newspaper PM. And Hecht, I guess as we all know, was a very brash, wear your opinions on your sleeve kind of guy. So his columns for PM, he didn't pull any punches. And he began writing about Jewish subjects in 1941 in response to some of the early reports of massacres of Jews in Europe. Hecht, from a personal perspective, Hecht was not someone who practiced Jewish religious traditions, rituals, laws, but he had a strong sense of Jewish, let's call it ethnic identity, sparked largely by the Hitler regime and the persecution of the Jews. In other words, Hecht was an accomplished literary figure, a major figure in the United States during the 1920s and 1930s. But like many Hollywood figures and other literary stars who were Jewish, he did not exhibit much interest in his Jewish roots. However, the persecution of the Jews in Europe, and what he correctly understood was a kind of a general onslaught against the Jews, not only in Germany, but also in other European countries, brought Hecht back into the Jewish fold with a roar. And it was a column that he wrote in PM talking about the silence of the world and even of many Jews in the face of Nazism that attracted Bergson's eye. So Bergson contacted Hecht. He went together with Merlin, and they met at the famous 21 Club in Manhattan, where Hecht often hung out with other literary figures, and explained to, and Bergson and Merlin explained to Hecht their Jewish army cause, and Hecht was immediately captivated and donated his services to the Bergson Group from that day and for many years to come. When the Jewish Army Committee changed its focus and became the Emergency Committee to rescue, the Emergency Committee to save the Jewish people of Europe, Hecht continued to be their most important literary voice, and it was he who created newspaper ads with what were at that time, for that era, shocking headlines, such as, how well are you sleeping? Is there something you could have done to save millions of Jews from massacre? Another one was Time Races Death. Time Races Death, incidentally, that was the newspaper ad which provided the inspiration for the title of the book that Professor David Wyman and I wrote many years ago, A Race Against Death, about the Bergson Group. The ads were important, first of all, because they shattered this curtain of silence surrounding the Holocaust, which had been in effect created by the news media's disinterest and by the Roosevelt administration's disinterest. If the Roosevelt administration had taken a serious interest in the issue, then the president could have, in effect, given out the word to major newspapers that this was something he cared about, and then it would have become a major public issue. So instead, the Bergson Group had to, in effect, force the issue into the headlines through newspaper ads, first of all. Second of all, lobbying in Washington. And today, of course, we are accustomed to having a major, as it's called, Jewish lobby in the nation's capital. Actually, there are a number of these of Jewish groups that lobby in Washington. AIPAC is, of course, the best known. But many people are surprised to learn that in the 1940s, there was no full-time organized Jewish lobby of any kind. So the Bergson Group was breaking new ground by initiating contacts on Capitol Hill. Not only was it breaking new ground by simply having a lobbying operation, but Bergson and his colleagues did something that very much aggravated the mainstream Jewish leaders. And when I say the mainstream Jewish leaders, I'm referring first and foremost to Rabbi Stephen S. Wise, who was the most prominent of the established Jewish leaders at that time. There were others, but Wise was the most important, both because he was the head of multiple Jewish institutions, American Jewish Congress, or World Jewish Congress, synagogue, or rabbinical seminary, and the American Zionist movement, but also because Wise had much greater access to President Roosevelt as one of his most ardent supporters than other Jewish leaders enjoyed. Rabbi Wise, as a loyal supporter of FDR, the New Deal, and the Democratic Party, was deeply disturbed when he began to learn that the Bergson people were going onto Capitol Hill and forging relationships not only with Democrats, but also with Republicans. Again, this is something which we take for granted today, that the only way to effectively promote a cause in the halls of power in Washington is to have supporters on both sides of the aisle. But that was not a given in the 1930s or 1940s. Rabbi Wise had almost no relationships with Republicans. He only cultivated ties to members of Congress with whom he shared positions on domestic issues as well. So that meant that he had relationships with a number of liberal Democrats, but almost nobody among the Republicans, and even very few conservative Democrats. This was what I would call a political handicap for Wise. It helped convince the president that he had Wise, the most important Jewish leader, in his pocket, in FDR's pocket, because since Wise had no relationships on the other side of the aisle, there was no one to whom Wise might turn if Roosevelt failed to respond to appeals to help Jewish refugees. But Bergson had a whole different approach. Bergson was not loyal to either Democrats or Republicans. He had no interest in American domestic politics at all. He was not an American, and he had no intention of staying in America. In fact, as we'll see, he went back to Palestine when Israel was created, and in fact served in the first Knesset, first parliament of the state of Israel. So these kinds of domestic American concerns, which in some ways tied Rabbi Wise's hands, were not relevant for Bergson and his colleagues. So they knocked on doors, and Bergson, in his in interviews after the war, and those interviews, in fact, were sort of the centerpiece of the book, A Race Against Death. Bergson describes how they didn't really have the budget or the staff to kind of gradually cultivate relationships on Capitol Hill, nor did they feel like they had the time because there was such an urgent crisis, slaughter of Europe's Jews going on every day, every hour. Therefore, he literally went and with his colleagues, with Merlin, but especially with a young rabbi named Baruch Rabinowitz, who became their chief lobbyist on Capitol Hill, and they knocked on doors, and they shook hands and introduced themselves, and one by one they found members of Congress who were quite sympathetic to the Bergson Group's central driving message, beginning in 1943, that the U.S. government should take some steps to try to help the Jews fleeing from mass murder in Europe. Now, it's interesting, it may be surprising to hear that a number of members of Congress were sympathetic to the Bergson Group, because for those of us who study American responses to the Holocaust, we know that in Congress there was a great deal of opposition, for example, opposition to increased immigration. In the 1930s, before World War II, whenever there was talk trying to bring in more Jewish refugees to America, there were a number of members of Congress who were vehemently opposed. And some of them even introduced legislation to try to cut off all immigration to the U.S. There were, in fact, a handful of members of Congress who were openly anti-Semitic. People like John Rankin of Mississippi and Louis McFadden of Pennsylvania and others who openly used anti-Semitic rhetoric in their speeches on Capitol Hill. And yet, despite the fact that there were a lot of these bad apples on Capitol Hill, the fact is that there were also a number of very good and decent people. And when the cause of the Jews was presented to them by Bergson and his colleagues, they responded positively. Now, what that meant in practical terms was that they added their names, these congressmen, they added their names to the newspaper ads that the Bergson Group was sponsoring. They gave speeches on the floor of the Senate and the floor of the House, which helped drum up public and congressional awareness of the plight of the Jews. And they openly criticized the Roosevelt administration for not taking any actions to help the Jews. Some of these allies of the Bergson Group were Republicans, but some of them were Democrats, like Senator Edwin Johnson of Colorado, Senator Elbert Thomas of Utah, and others. Others were Republicans, and interestingly, former President Herbert Hoover was among those who lent his name to some of the Bergson Group's efforts. He even addressed one of the group's important conferences in 1943. Keeping in mind that Hoover was the only living ex-president at that time, it meant something when he had something to say. Yes, he had been defeated in 1932, but many Americans still held him in high regard, even though, of course, FDR was extremely popular. But Hoover was widely respected, and it was significant to have the only living ex-president speaking out and saying that something should be done to help the Jews. And there were other important Republicans who were in Bergson's corner. For example, a rising young star from Connecticut, Claire Booth Luce, was another important and influential figure in the Republican Party who was supportive of the Bergson Group's efforts. Now, obviously, in our limited time, I'm not going to go into tremendous detail about the history and impact of the Bergson Group. I'm just going to touch on some of the major themes and Ben Hecht's important role. And if you want to learn more about the Bergson Group, please visit the website of the David Wyman Institute for Holocaust Studies. That's www.wymaninstitute.org, W-Y-M-A-N institute.org, where you'll find many articles about the Bergson Group. You'll find an online photo exhibit of the Bergson Group's activities, as well as a number of books that we've published, or that I've written, that were others have published, which are available for sale there. The reason Hecht was important, well, there were several reasons why Hecht was important, and why the two theatrical pageants that he created, We Will Never Die and A Flag is Born, were so important. I know it doesn't make a lot of sense, and as a historian, I'm not happy about this, but it is a fact that what cultural celebrities say on political and social issues does have an impact. And even though many of us may frown when, let's say the movie star has some loud comment on a political issue on which either he or she does not have a lot of expertise, nonetheless, a lot of people pay attention. And that was true in the 1940s as well. So bringing aboard Ben Hecht was crucial not only for the power of those powerful newspaper ads that he created, but also because he brought along the cachet of the endorsement of Hollywood. And it was not only Hecht, because Hecht brought along with him a slew of celebrities, his colleagues. In other words, he recruited other stars of stage and screen, Broadway and Hollywood, to join him. And even though his name is the best remembered as among these celebrities who helped Bergson, when those new ads appeared in the newspapers, you would see not only Hecht's name on the list of endorsers, but you would also see other major figures. And in their public events, there would be appearances by people like the actor Edward G. Robinson, um, uh, musical stars. This is after the war, but musical stars like Frank Sinatra, movie stars like young Marlon Brando, and many, many others. It's a very long list. And the point is, though, that Hollywood and Broadway carried a certain power in terms of influencing public opinion. So when an advisor, let's say, to President Roosevelt would open up the morning newspaper, remember, this is the era before television, and newspapers were the primary source of news media reporting. When they opened up, if an aide opened up the morning newspaper and saw an ad from the Bergson Group, it was not just these are the opinions of Peter Bergson and Yitzhak Ben-Ami and Samuel Merlin, but he would see the names of major cultural figures whom he recognized and respected. And so therefore, the ads carried a punch beyond just Hecht's very strong, sometimes acerbic language, but they carried the power of the names, a cross-section of celebrities. And these celebrities, by the way, largely were from the political left. Now, this is important because they were, in effect, part of President Roosevelt's coalition. They were politically liberal, they were Democrats, they were New Deal supporters. So it's one thing for a Herbert Hoover to criticize Roosevelt on any issue. That would be not a surprise. But the real man bites dog angle would come when prominent liberal Democrat cultural figures, writers and artists and musicians and actors, when they would speak out about the Roosevelt administration's abandonment of the Jews. So, for example, when a feisty journalist like F.I.F. Stone, who was a Bergson Group supporter, would write in the pages of PM, the newspaper PM, it meant something. When Frida Kirchway, the editor of The Nation, the political news weekly, which was staunchly liberal, when she wrote editorials, as she did, accusing the Roosevelt administration of being accomplices, that was her word, in the destruction of the Jews, those kinds of protests raised eyebrows, carried a punch, and they gave the Bergson Group an ability to have influence far beyond its very small numbers and its meager budget and its minuscule staff. Hecht, on two occasions, 1943 and 1946, created a spectacular cross between a protest rally and a musical number, which he called a pageant. Now, I know that David Fruchtman, you and your colleagues have have been discussing these pageants and had a stage reading of one of them recently. The first one, called "We Will Never Die," was held at Madison Square Garden in March 1943. It arose out of discussions that Hecht had with the other Bergson Group leaders, especially with Yitzhak Ben-Ami. I found some correspondence between Ben-Ami and Hecht in my research, which indicated that it was Ben-Ami, in fact, who first came up with this idea that perhaps they could have some kind of a cultural protest event at Madison Square Garden. Hecht then created the script, concept, for this spectacular event. "We will never die," that phrase is a biblical phrase referring to the eternity of the Jewish people. The Jewish people will never be completely vanquished. So it was a kind of a cry of hope and affirmation exactly at the time when the Jews in Europe were facing their darkest hour. The event itself featured, and it was kind of typical for Hecht and kind of its grandiose Hollywood style of the era, two 40-foot high recreations of the tablets of the Ten Commandments. There were 100 rabbis, or people dressed as rabbis, on stage reciting Kaddish, the Jewish memorial prayer for the dead, reciting in unison. There were all sorts of spectacular scenes, some involving Edward G. Robinson, others involving Stella Adler, Paul Muni, other important Hollywood figures. in a show which packed Madison Square Garden. The garden in those days could fit about 20,000 people. This was the old Madison Square Garden, a few blocks from where the current building is located. 20,000 people filled the garden that evening, and there were so many people outside that the cast decided, Hecht and the cast decided on the spur of the moment, to do a second show after the first so that the other people could come in, and a second standing room only crowd of some 20,000 then filled the garden. So 40,000 people saw this event on the night that it was held. The Bergson people approached the White House beforehand and asked if the president would send a very brief message just greeting the attendees, but the White House refused. And we know from internal correspondence that the president and his aides were concerned that if they added a presidential connection of any kind to this event, that it would be lending legitimacy to a group which the administration was increasingly regarding as its enemy, because the Bergson Group was pushing the issue of Jewish rescue at a time when, of course, the administration did not want to take any steps, whether to bring in more Jewish refugees or other action that could have been taken to help the Jews in Europe. So the White House refused to send that message. The show went on without that, of course. But it's telling that the president was not even willing to make that minor gesture. After We Will Never Die was staged at Madison Square Garden, the Bergson Group then took it on the road. They then staged the event at other cities around the country, Boston, Chicago, ultimately at the Hollywood Bowl in California, Los Angeles, and very importantly in Washington, D.C. And I say that was important because a large group of members of Congress, Supreme Court justices, and others, including First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, attended that event in Washington. So to begin with, it was an important awareness raising, a consciousness raising kind of a protest, almost a rally. Secondly, each of these out-of-town performances attracted enormous local publicity. So even those who did not attend the performance read about them the next day in the Boston Globe or the Chicago Tribune or in the Washington Press. So news of these protests were reaching a lot of people who hadn't been hearing about the plight of the Jews because the local newspapers had been playing it down. The fact that the First Lady attended was very important because Eleanor Roosevelt authored a weekly newspaper column. She had a syndicated column called My Day. And in the column she wrote a few days after attending the performance in Washington, she devoted a portion of the column to describing the pageant. And then there too, she brought this story of what We Will Never Die was talking about to a tremendous audience. She had a readership of about 1 million. That's a lot of people hearing about the plight of the Jews. Just to clarify, We Will Never Die was not a critique of the Roosevelt administration. It did not denounce the administration's abandonment of the Jews. It was essentially a portrayal, first of all, of Jewish contributions to Western civilization throughout the ages, and then culminating in the terrible suffering the Jews were undergoing in Nazi Germany and German-occupied territories. Some of the later performances, the out-of-town performances, Hecht added a few lines at the end which referred to the fact that the nations of the world were not responding. But even then, he didn't single out the Roosevelt administration for the reasons I described earlier. Excuse me. But the pageant accomplished its purpose. Its central purpose was to shatter the silence surrounding the slaughter of the Jews, and it helped do that. It wasn't the only factor. There were others who helped pierce that silence, but We Will Never Die was very important for that reason. All of the actors, by the way, whom Hecht recruited for the cast of the show, all of them performed pro bono. Nobody charged. They all wanted to be part of the cause. they wanted to contribute in their particular way, with their particular talents, to trying to do something to publicize or alleviate the plight of the Jews. So that was We Will Never Die. We Will Never Die helped set the stage for the Bergson Group's many protests and activities in the months that followed. But it was important because the campaign had to start somewhere, and raising public awareness was the place to start. Making people understand that this was happening, then you could say to them, and now let's do something about it. The Bergson Group had specific ideas about what they thought the Roosevelt administration would do about it. And these range from allowing refugees into America temporarily for the duration of the war, to other steps later, such as bombing the railway lines leading to Auschwitz. The Bergson Group was among those who raised that idea in 1944. The point is, though, that the Bergson Group was very interested in specific action, not just speaking in generalities or seeking the pity of the world, but on the contrary, seeking action, first and foremost from the United States, to either interrupt the mass murder or to alleviate, or to directly alleviate the plight of Jewish refugees who were fleeing from Hitler, desperately looking for some place to go, but finding themselves faced by doors that closed in their faces all around the world, including the United States. The full story of the Bergson Group's response to the Holocaust and what Hecht and Bergson achieved, you can find again on our website, and the books and articles that have been written by myself and my colleagues about this subject. But now I'd like to move ahead into the post-war period. The Bergson Group did not go out of business when the Holocaust ended. The Emergency Committee to Save the Jewish People of Europe transformed itself into two new groups, one known as the American League for Free Palestine, the other as the Hebrew Committee of National Liberation. I won't go into the details about why they had two groups, but both of them ultimately were promoting the same cause, and that is that there should be a Jewish state in the land of Israel, in British Mandatory Palestine. So, as soon as the war concluded, the Bergson Group shifted its attention to that cause. But the tactics were similar. Public rallies, lobbying in Washington, and again, newspaper ads, and once again, using the stage to publicize the plight of the Jews. In the post-war period, the plight of the Jews meant the plight of hundreds of thousands of Holocaust survivors who were languishing in displaced persons camps in Europe. No country really wanted to take in any substantial number of them. Most of them wanted to go to Palestine. The British were still keeping the doors of Palestine shut because of Palestinian Arab violence and opposition. And so what the Bergson Group was lobbying for was for the U.S. Truman administration to pressure the British to open Palestine to survivors of the Holocaust. That was the cause. In 1946, Hecht created a Broadway play called A Flag is Born. And the idea behind the play, similar to the idea behind We Will Never Die, was to use the familiar and attractive medium of a cultural performance to make people aware, to make the public aware of this pressing political and especially humanitarian cause. Flag is Born starred young Marlon Brando, as well as Paul Muni, who, as I mentioned, had previously been in We Will Never Die, and Celia Adler, who was another member of the illustrious Adler family of actors from the Yiddish theater. The plot revolved around a meeting, an unexpected meeting in a cemetery in Europe after the war, a meeting between young Marlon Brando and this elderly couple, Muni and Adler, who were survivors of some concentration camp. and who had sort of paused in the cemetery on their long but futile journey to try to reach the Holy Land. And along comes a young, hot-headed Marlon Brando just before he had achieved national fame in film and theater. Along comes a young Marlon Brando, who is who's cast in the role of a character named David, who represents the young generation of Zionist pioneers and underground fighters who are trying to shake off British rule in Palestine. And there you have this dramatic sort of clash of the generations and attitudes between the elderly survivors and the young militant. And it's a very, you can tell from the script that it was a very dramatic and moving production. But sadly, there are no known existing video or audio records of A Flag is Born. There are stills, there are photos from a number of the scenes. But neither I nor any of my colleagues researching these areas have ever succeeded in finding any tape recordings or video of any of their performances. By the way, by contrast with We Will Never Die, you can find snippets of We Will Never Die, actual footage on YouTube, because some brief scenes were included in Movie House newsreel scenes at the time in 1943 of We Will Never Die. So what we have left from A Flag is Born is we have the script, we have the stills, and some very interesting recollections of the performances and the rehearsals and so on, some of which I describe in another one of my books, Militant Zionism in America. Brando, of course, is the most interesting character in this story because, first of all, because of the tremendous fame that he soon achieved. And in his autobiography, Brando's autobiography, he shares a very interesting anecdote that I want to recall for you. He described how the audiences frequently were filled with, that many people in the audience became very emotional, that it was, the characters on stage were talking about horrific things that had just happened in Europe, just, less than a year earlier. People had seen the post-war scenes, the newsreel footage of the liberated death camps. And now you had on stage in this dramatic fashion, created by Hecht and performed by Muni and Adler and Brando, these extraordinary scenes. So he said many people were very emotional. He said very often there would be young women in the audience who would be overcome, tears. And he said that there was one particular scene that really drew a lot of audience reaction at the moment. And this was a point at which Brando turns to the audience and begins speaking very critically of the failure of American Jews to protest more actively to try to rescue their fellow Jews from the Holocaust. It's a very accusatory speech. This is Ben Hecht denouncing, especially the American Jewish leadership, but in general, talks about the comfortable and quiet Jews who sat idly by while the gas chambers took their daily toll and so forth. And in this sort of brief monologue, Brando recalls how his voice would rise gradually as he would say, "Where were you, American Jews, ... Where were you? Where?" And his voice would go louder and louder. And he said in one performance, after he had reached like the loudest point in that monologue, yelling, "Where were you?" A young woman leaped to her feet and crying and very emotionally yelled back at him, "Where were you?" Brando embraced this cause of Jewish statehood with passion and verve. Not only did he act in the Broadway shows of A Flag Is Born, which went for something like 9 weeks on Broadway. But he also went around the country and spoke at Bergson Group rallies for the next year or so. So he made a real effort to promote this cause. Like with We Will Never Die, Flag Is Born, when it left Broadway, it then went to other cities and was performed elsewhere. We even have a report that it was performed in Yiddish in one of the DP camps in Europe. And I don't have more information on that. That's something which we're continuing to look for details about. But it was quite a sensation. Flag Is Born. It was denounced by the British government, by the way. No surprise. They subsequently announced a complete ban on all works by Ben Hecht. No films, and he was a major scriptwriter for Hollywood. No films by Ben Hecht could be shown in England. So Hecht had to use pseudonyms for quite some time in the late 40s in order to continue making a living. But the play itself, A Flag Is Born, it did what the Bergson Group intended. It attracted a lot of attention for the cause. It put the power of some of America's cultural celebrities behind that cause. It also raised quite a bit of money. There were teenage volunteers would go up and down the aisles during intermission at the Broadway performances, maybe the out-of-town performances as well, with buckets. And people would throw in change and dollar bills. By the way, I mentioned earlier Frida Kirchway, the editor of The Nation. One of her successors, Victor Navasky, some of you will recognize his name, was one of those teenage volunteers who went up and down the aisles collecting change. And they ended up collecting quite a bit of money, and it was used to purchase a ship in France, a ship which was renamed. The Bergson Group bought a ship, refurbished it, renamed it the SS Ben Hecht, sailed it to a port in France where 800 Holocaust survivors boarded it, and then it sailed for Palestine and tried to break the British blockade, which then meant a whole nother round of publicity about the plight of the Jews and their and the cause of trying to create a Jewish state. I want to conclude with a fascinating anecdote about A Flag Is Born, something which I think is particularly significant at a time for us today when the issues of racism and discrimination are so much a topic of everyone's concern. So A Flag Is Born went from Broadway to, among other cities, Washington. It was scheduled to be performed in Washington, D.C., but just before the scheduled performance in early 1947, Ben Hecht had been one of 33 playwrights who had signed a public statement saying they would not allow their plays to be performed in racially segregated theaters. The people who were the managers who had booked the play to be staged in Washington had, I think unknowingly, booked a segregated theater. So once Hecht heard about that, he immediately ordered them to go elsewhere. So they broke that contract, and they instead booked it for a theater in Baltimore, where it was not segregated. So they thought at first it would be fine, but it was African Americans were allowed to attend, but they were forced to sit in the balcony. So they got the bad seats. And racists had a very ugly name for that balcony, which I'm not going to repeat, but it was a sign of the times. In Baltimore in those days, all of the theaters were racially segregated, or had this kind of restriction. So just days before the show was going to play in Baltimore, Hecht learned about this fact that blacks would be restricted to the balcony. So the Bergson Group approached the theater management to demand that they change that policy. The theater management refused. They said that, and this is an excuse of often was heard, by those who promoted segregation. They said, we're not racist, but if we do this, the public will riot. So we can't allow blacks to sit wherever they want. So what the Bergson Group did in the days leading up to the performance is they teamed up with the local NAACP. And they had a kind of a good cop, bad cop arrangement where the NAACP threatened to picket the performance, and the Bergson Group threatened to bring in African American patrons as their guests to, in effect, force their way into the regular seats. Faced with this imaginative protest, the theater management decided at the last second the way they could get out of this is that they would turn over the entire management of the theater to the American League for a Free Palestine for that evening. So they washed their hands of anything, of any responsibility for allowing blacks to sit in the same seats as whites. And so, for the first time in the history of the city of Baltimore, a major theater allowed whites and blacks to sit side by side in the same seats. It was a tremendous victory, not only for the great principle of racial equality, but also because it set a precedent. And I myself spent some time looking through the records of the NAACP, including its Baltimore chapter, to try to understand what impact this event had. And what I found was that the NAACP in Baltimore then was able to use the precedent of the Flag is Born integrated performance to force other theaters in Baltimore to desegregate. Because the fact that a Flag is Born had gone off without any of the so-called riots that were threatened or imagined proved, it served as proof in court that there was no such danger and that there was no reason for any kind of discrimination in the theater. So thanks to a Flag is Born, the entire history of African American civil rights in Baltimore was changed for the better. In a statement that Hecht issued, he said that as far as he and his colleagues at the American League for Free Palestine were concerned, the fight against racism and racial injustice, whether in the theaters of Baltimore or in the struggle to create a state for the Jews, was all part of the same struggle for human decency. And he was proud, Hecht said, that his play had served a role in advancing that great cause. I think at this point I'd like to conclude my remarks and invite everyone to ask questions. And I'm happy to stay with you as long as there are questions. And I believe David Fruchtman will be moderating the Q&A.
Excellent. That was truly fascinating, I have to say. And I invite people for questions to use the raise hand feature, and then I'll turn it over to you. While people are doing that, I have a question. I wonder, did the FBI compile information about the Bergson Group or any of its members? And if so, what did that information show?
The answer is yes. A number of years ago, through the Freedom of Information Act, I was able to access about 1,200 pages of internal FBI documents about its interest in the Bergson Group. Now, its interest in the Bergson Group began around 1942, when the Bergsonites were first starting to gain a lot of attention. And it was clear from the documents I found, even though many of them had names and other information blacked out, it was clear that the reason the FBI began investigating them was at the request of Secretary of State Cordell Hull. Actually, the way they put it was, we understand these people, the Bergson people, are getting in the hair of Cordell Hull. So clearly there came a request from the State Department to investigate. What the FBI was looking for was several things. First of all, they wanted to determine if perhaps Bergson or any of his colleagues had overstayed their visas, and if therefore they could be deported. It was also investigating whether or not they were communists. I mentioned that there were many people from the political left who were supporters of the Bergson Group. Some of them were very far to the left, like Paul Robeson, for example, people who were accused of being for documents in which some FBI officials, including J. Edgar Hoover, specifically accused Ben Hecht of being a communist sympathizer. I won't go into the details of the whole of suspicion and so forth, but suffice it to say that they were keenly interested in that. And the third area that they were hoping to find information on that would enable them to act against Bergson was any connections between the Bergson Group and the Jewish underground in Palestine known as the Irgun, or the Irgun Tzvai Leumi, which was the underground militia led by Menachem Begin, which fought for independence against the British. And the Bergson people, Bergson himself and the others, they had some connections to the Irgun before the war, but while they were in the United States, they were engaged only in above ground, legitimate political activity. And so the FBI could not find any connections to the Irgun. They couldn't call them terrorists. There was no evidence that they were communists. And there was no evidence in general that they were breaking the law in any way. Bergson had, in fact, overstayed his visa, but several of Bergson's allies in Congress intervened to ensure that he would not be deported. So in the end, that technicality was not used to deport him or take any other action. So yes, just give you a sense of the lengths to which they went. They wiretapped the Bergson Group's headquarters. They eavesdropped on their phone calls. They went through their garbage, looking for things they had thrown out that might be incriminating some way. They planted informers, Jewish informers, in the Bergson Group, hoping to get inside information. And I go into I describe all this in detail in the book Militant Zionism in America, where I quote from those pages. Just by the way, just as an aside, sometimes the FBI's monitoring of Bergson was extremely sloppy. And since we're talking about We Will Never Die, I will mention that in their documents where they're talking about it, they refer to it as We Kill, the K, We Kill, comma, Never Die. They couldn't even get the name straight. The Bergson Group, by the way, it voluntarily disbanded after 1948, after Israel was created, because it was it had been established to address an emergency and then a post-war emergency, but it was not at all intended to be an ongoing Jewish organization. It's probably the only time in American Jewish history where a Jewish organization voluntarily went out of business that I can think of. But in any event, the FBI's surveillance of the Bergson Group was so inept that they were still spying on them in 1952, more than a year after they had gone out of business. So not that a more efficient surveillance would have uncovered anything, because the Bergson Group really was not guilty of the things that the Roosevelt administration imagined it might be guilty of. But, they tried. They tried to find what they could.
All right. So I received a note that people are having a hard time finding the raise hand feature. So I guess what I'll do, this is not the way I tended to moderate this, but if you have a question, take your mic off and hopefully it'll be organized. While people are doing that, I will toss out one more for you. Okay. So in Child of the Century, Ben Hecht recounts a conversation with Peter Bergson in which Hecht says that in terms of calling attention to the massacre occurring in Europe, we're wasting our time doing this pageant. And instead, he preferred pressuring FDR to rescue Europe's Jews. Now, I know you have some views about FDR's, informed views, obviously, well-informed views about FDR's attitude towards saving the Jews. So, was Hecht right? Was there a more effective approach than the pageant to trying to accomplish what they were trying to accomplish?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that the combination of different protest tactics which they employed ultimately was the most effective strategy. I'm not saying the Bergson Group didn't make mistakes. Easy for us to say in hindsight they should have done this or should have done that. But I think the fact that they used a variety of approaches was a good one, because they could have just taken out newspaper ads, but that would have been rather one-dimensional. I think the fact that they were creative, that they brought in these artistic, cultural celebrities and others, and tried different media. They tried using the stage, using Madison Square Garden, lobbying. There was a march by more than 400 Orthodox rabbis through the streets of Washington to the White House, which the Bergson Group conceived and helped organize. I think all of these kinds of different tactics helped keep the cause in the headlines. It gave the news media something interesting to write about in describing the plight of the Jews and the group that was trying to draw attention to their cause. It made it more newsworthy, and ultimately, in those circumstances, with a news media that was not very interested in the plight of the Jews, it really was crucially important for the Bergson Group to continually come up with things that would attract the eye, that would bring the public to take notice, and therefore would increase the pressure on the administration to do something.
Okay. Thank you. Anybody else? I think.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Go ahead, Ben.
Hi, my name is Ben Ovadia. I just was curious to know, during the time of the Bergson Group in 1942 and afterwards in America, were there any other, I guess namely Jewish organizations, but in general organizations that had combined with the Bergson Group or made a decision to unify themselves with the Bergsonites to raise these issues and combat the inaction of the U.S. government or even the awareness of the American people or the Jewish people in the United States?
There were, in fact, several other sources of protest during this extreme Jewish organizations. The American Jewish Congress, the World Jewish Congress, to a much lesser extent, the American Jewish Committee. These were groups that had significant resources, paid staffs, and their job was to defend Jewish rights and Jewish causes. In general, they were extremely restrained. I'm speaking charitably during this period, but that does not mean they were completely silent. What it means is that they did not make a sustained and vocal, creative effort to have an impact. Rabbi Wise did meet with President Roosevelt on a number of occasions and did ask him to take steps to aid the Jews. But when Roosevelt, in effect, said no, Wise took no for an answer. Other groups, such as the World Jewish Congress, tried to raise public awareness, but in a much more limited way. I think the central problem in the approach of the mainstream groups was that they had trouble thinking outside the box. They were thinking very conventional of rabbis marching through the streets of Washington. That was exactly what they did not want. They considered that kind of protest to be embarrassing, and they feared that it might provoke anti-Semitism. So those kinds of unusual protests were something that never entered their minds. And so they approached it kind of through the conventional method, which is the carefully worded press release and the mildly worded petition or a press conference with very cautious demands and so forth. So they didn't have the power that the crisis of the moment demanded. That's so much for the established groups. Obviously, I'm just summarizing the overall rescue-oriented group that arose in the Orthodox community specifically was the Vad HaHatzalah. the Hebrew for the Rescue Committee, Committee for Rescue, which first was created in around 1940, specifically in order to aid rabbis and yeshiva students who were trapped in Europe and trying to escape. But the Vaad Hatzalah soon broadened its agenda and was involved in a number of activities trying to help Jews of all sorts. And it was the Vaad Hatzalah which played the central role in mobilizing the manpower for that march through the streets of Washington that to which I alluded. So the Vaad Hatzalah was an important organization. They raised funds which were sent to Europe and were used behind the scenes, sometimes for bribery, sometimes for sheltering, sometimes to procure visas or other transit visas to get Jews out of the path of the Nazis. And there have been several books written about the history of the Vaad Hatzalah. I can tell you the full story. Aside from the Vaad Hatzalah and the mainstream groups that I've mentioned, there were a couple of very much smaller groups whose activities were interesting but much more limited. One was only active in the 1930s, before the war. It was called Brooklyn Jewish Democracy, and it was a kind of a grassroots, more activist version of the American Jewish Congress, which Rabbi Wise resented very greatly as competition and did his best to help snuff them out. They were active from about 1935 to 1938. I talk about their rise and Wise's efforts to undermine them in the book, The Jews Should Keep Quiet, Franklin Roosevelt, Rabbi Stephen S. Wise, and the Holocaust. That's my most recent book. In the 1940s, there was a small Jewish college student protest group arose. This was at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, the conservative Judaism's rabbinical seminary. A handful of students there, led by Noah Golinkin, Buddy Sachs, and Jerry Lipnick, started their own protest group, which, not having any budget or staff, didn't get very far, but it accomplished one very significant thing. They, through a series of behind-the-scenes meetings, they managed to pressure the Synagogue Council of America to undertake a very important educational campaign in the spring and summer of 1943. Now, the Synagogue Council of America was the umbrella group for Orthodox, conservative, and Reform rabbinical organizations. And their purpose was the council's purpose was to find areas of common interest, despite these three movements' different theological differences. Helping Jews who were suffering in Europe was certainly a cause that they all had in common. The Student Protest Committee convinced the Synagogue Council of America to start a campaign, a 6-week-long campaign during the period known as the Sfiras HaOmer, period between Passover and Shavuos, semi-morning, during which the Synagogue Council sent out constant mailings to synagogues all across the country, asking them to take a number of very concrete steps, which both raised public awareness about the mass killing and also encouraged people to actually take practical steps. Like, for example, it urged them to write to their congressman, to write to the president. It also urged people to alter their daily behavior, for example, by adding several lines about the suffering of the Jews in Europe to the daily benching, the Birkat HaMazon, the blessings that are said after one eats the meal. The Synagogue Council also plotted out and gave to all these synagogues how-to kits, how to hold a memorial rally in their synagogue, how to involve local Christian clergy in protests to help the Jews in Europe, and so forth. So this was a very important kind of grassroots effort, which the Synagogue Council undertook in the spring and early summer of 1943, which helped keep the whole issue of the plight of Jews in Europe, and especially the possibility of U.S. intervention to keep those issues on the front burner, and that reinforced the kinds of activities that the Bergson Group was undertaking. And so these multiple sources of pressure, Bergson Group, Vat Hatzalah, student protesters, and the limited efforts of the establishment groups, all of these factors combine to create a sense of urgency in the American Jewish community, which helped put pressure on the Roosevelt administration during 1943 and into 1944.
So I think we should take one more question. I think it looks like Lawrence and Beverly might have a question. Am I right about that?
Yes, Dr. Medoff, could you please tell us a source or sources where we can find images of these 200 ads that were published by the Bergson Group during the war? We found a few on the internet, but that's all.
Well, you can find some of them on the Wyman Institute's website, there where we have a significant amount of material and also a photo exhibit about the Bergson Group. And so some of the ads are reproduced there. Some of them are reproduced in my books. There is no comprehensive collection of these ads that I know of. There may yet one day be a book. That's a project that my colleagues and I have been working on for some time that would collect the ads. Just one note of clarification. When I speak of 200 ads, I'm not speaking of 200 different ads. What I'm talking about is those are the number of placements. So a typical Bergson Group newspaper ad might appear in 8 or 10 or more newspapers at a time. So there were many dozens of different ads. Altogether, all of their placements, publications, came to more than 200 during those years.
Could I ask a quick question?
Yes, please, go ahead.
First of all, am I right that Bergson was Rav Kook's nephew? Does that sound right? It looks like.
Yeah, so Bergson, again, his real name was Hillel Kook.
Yeah.
So he was the son of an important rabbi in Palestine, and he was the nephew of the chief rabbi. The chief rabbi was, as you noted, Avraham Yitzhak HaKohen Kook, the chief rabbi of British Mandatory Palestine. And this was his nephew. And in fact, the main reason that Kook began using the name Bergson was because he was concerned that if he would be undertaking controversial public activities in the United States, that the news media or others might then begin bothering his very well-known relatives back in Palestine. So he was shielding them, what we would call today protecting them from the paparazzi by using that pseudonym. When he was in the U.S., the fact that his name was Hillel Kook was not known at all.
The last thing, why on earth did the Hecht family move to Racine, Wisconsin? I'm from Racine, and I remember Hecht's. This would have been late 60s, early 70s. I'm just wondering, how did they, of all the places they could have gone, why Racine?
Well, no, I don't know the answer to that offhand. It may or may not be mentioned in Hecht's autobiography, A Child of the Century. Another possible source would be an extremely important essay about Hecht written many years ago by Professor Gil Troy. Gil wrote this essay back in his graduate student days, and we published, that is the Wyman Institute, we published a version of it in a special issue of the Journal of Ecumenical Studies. We were the guest editor 30th anniversary of the publication of The Abandonment of the Jews, David Wyman's definitive study of America's response to the Holocaust. So that whole issue of the Journal of Ecumenical Studies was about Wyman's book, its impact, and we also showcased new research on different aspects of how Americans respond to the Holocaust. So Gil Troy's very important essay on Ben Hecht's activities in his life and his Jewish protest activities was among the research we featured there. So copies of that journal also can be ordered through the Wyman Institute's website.
Well, I will say a couple things. First, I have no idea of how to applaud over the internet in this sort of environment, but the notes I'm getting from people are that they are blown away by this presentation. So thank you very much. And,
My pleasure.
I'm going to circulate the link to the Wyman Institute as well as your email address, so in case people want to sign up for your newsletters, they can do that. And I want to thank you again for this was a very generous offer and a truly outstanding presentation. So,
well, you're very. And for anyone who did not have a chance to ask their question, just contact us through the website wymaninstitute.org, and I'll be glad to respond to you there. Thanks. Take care.
Excellent.